Lithium-ion batteries represent the cradle of today's portability and are perceived as the key to a promised electric future of humming electric cars and clean energy, free of guilt and CO2. Lithium, a key battery component, is the lightest metal in the periodic table of elements. Competition is thriving among those who will supply the increasing battery demand for homes and transportation, sparking new industries and speculation over its components, such as aluminum, copper, cobalt, nickel, and lithium. In 2015, 500,000 electric drive vehicles were sold in the United States. 70,000 of these units were battery-powered EVs, only 0.4% of the US car market. By 2040, EVs and plug-in hybrids are expected to jump to 35% of global new car sales. That is 40 million EVs sold every year. A Tesla Model S requires 63 kilos of lithium, an equivalent to over 10,000 smartphones. In the last 15 years, battery use has jumped from 5 to 39% of the global lithium market. Traditionally, this was shared with the ceramics, lubricants, aluminum, and pharma industries. Total production will jump from 163,000 tons of lithium today to over 500,000 in 2025. By then, the battery share of the lithium market will almost double, reaching 70%. Battery production will continue to be concentrated in few countries, with China taking the lead with over 2/3 of production in the next few years.
We actually did the calculations to say, like, what would it take to transition the whole world to sustainable energy? What kind of throughput would you actually need? And you need 100 gigafactories.
So 100 of these?
100 of these, yes.
That would make the United States...
No, the whole world.
The whole world?
The whole world. All energy.
That's it?
Yeah.
That sounds...
It's manageable.
That sounds manageable.
Yeah.
Framed by the southern continental Andes and producing 1/3 of the world's lithium and over 1/5 of copper, the Atacama Desert, the most arid place in the world, leads among Earth's biomes to supply this green future. It is a hinterland of hinterlands at a planetary scale, inscribed in the lithium triangle shared between Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile, holding over half of the world's reserves. Lithium deposits here exist within salt flats, where underground water is pumped to the surface. High solar evaporation and scarce rainfall make desert salt flats the perfect lithium extraction site. Water supply for the coastal cities and intensive mineral extraction have sparked ongoing conflicts over water availability, considering the desert's limited capacity to recharge its aquifers. Widespread desert infrastructure networks of fossil fuel power plants, mining refineries, logistics, and massive chemical waste tailing dams, all linked to extracting copper, silver, gold, iron, lead, manganese, potash, iodide, boron, and other elements, take their own toll in surrounding and downstream desert valley communities, conforming a series of sacrifice zones. A historic rendering of the Atacama Desert and its geographic setting as an extraction hinterland, from the Pacific coast to the Andes Mountains, has been mobilized for centuries, transforming the lives of indigenous populations and farming communities that have inhabited the moist, high plateaus and fertile river valleys of the desert for over a dozen millennia. Different indigenous groups developed topographically interrelated living systems, with gathering, fishing, hunting, farming, and herding activities, exchanging geographical strata and performing trade between the coast, the desert, and the high plateau. Transversally, life interdependencies respond to sectional geographical features upon ecological levels, as well as an Andean yearly time cycle of 3 seasons, cold, dry, and wet, across equinox and solstice marking the Aymara New Year, the periods for taking herds up and down to summer or winter grasslands, optimal sowing and harvesting times, and when shepherds help farmers prepare the land. Longitudinally, the same road infrastructure the Incas built to expand their empire along the Andes and the desert, the Chapacñan, facilitated the Spanish conqueror's path, who concentrated indigenous communities in townships and forced them to work in the desert silver and guano deposits, developing the colonial production system of natural fertilizers and explosives for war and mining. Upscaling these early resource industries, nitrate ore fields located in the desert core became the flagship commodity in the region, originally as part of Peru and Bolivia after the independence from Spain. Disagreements between nations over nitrate tax on Chilean capitals led to the Pacific War in 1879, while Chile landlocking Bolivia out of the Pacific Ocean and seizing what would become half of the state's revenue. Though hard to visualize today, hundreds of thousands of hectares of forest made of saline-resistant species covered the desert nitrate plains and surrounded its salt flats, living off the underground freshwater aquifers infiltrating from the yearly plateau rains. At the desert's core, these woody plants of the Prosopis genus articulated the migratory living systems between the Andean Plateau and the sea. Tamarugo trees turned from being a diverse resource provider of food, fodder, heat, building material, medicine, desert shade, and textile components to exclusively fueling the early-stage boilers of the nitrate industrial network that expanded across the Atacama. With nearly 100 production plants by the turn of the 20th century, which exterminated the forest down to a few relics. Most nitrate extraction infrastructure belonged to British capitals, whose interest even fueled the Chilean Civil War of 1891, ending up with the suicide of President Balmaceda, whose social development reforms were supposedly to be funded by the desert's industry. This became undermined by nitrate's biggest investor and controller, the British John Thomas North. With the invention of the Haber-Bosch nitrogen fixation method for ammonia-based fertilizer and the end of both world wars, the nitrate boom was over. In parallel, the copper industry had been developing thanks to U.S. capitals. Between the late 1960s and early 70s, the Chilean government decided to nationalize copper and expropriate foreign companies in benefit of the state. The military coup of 1973 led to the drafting of a new Chilean constitution, which in 1980 reopened the mining and water rights for concessions in a free market scheme. By 1995, private mining companies had already surpassed the state copper mining giant Codelco, while SQM, the state company created to reorganize the remaining nitrate industry in Chile, was privatized by Pinochet's son-in-law, becoming one of the top 3 lithium suppliers in the world today. Today, the Atacama Desert region foresees over $33 billion in new mining projects in less than a decade, with constantly soaring water and electricity use both for mining and growing coastal metropolises. The fight over resources continues to transcend state borders, perpetuating international frictions over the sovereignty of water rights along the Andes. The scales of territorial dispossession have also emerged in between state borders. A binational mining accord signed between Chile and Argentina in 1997 has pushed forward the transboundary nature of corporate mining, placing extraction sites directly on mountaintops and glaciers. The state has facilitated extraction both across desert aquifers and at the very source of life along the Andean Ridge. Although national parks have been created to preserve the remaining desert forest, lagoons, and its fauna, conservation standards have not only been unable to grasp the invisibility and interdependence of arid living systems, but created enclosures for historical relics only visible above ground. These standards tend to serve more a global trend of iconic stasis and flamingo-watching luxury tourism. while fragments of the Chapagnan and derelict nitrate offices across the desert are declared World Heritage by UNESCO, Andean states are not only conveniently in denial of the remaining living systems of indigenous communities, but bluntly overlooking the very opportunity the desert has provided as a source of life and resources for thousands of years. Trapped between extraction and conservation, the desert feeds state and metropolitan structures of power who have gone to war and continue to fight over its minerals. The desert has not only been rendered as a dry and dead industrial hinterland, but as a threat to cities through the concept of increasing desertification. Climate change evidences desert moisture. Glaciers and water bodies recede, pushing Bolivia to declare a national emergency over drought. Simultaneously, rain episodes become more intense, generating violent desert flash floods that carry down toxic tailing dams and wipe out whole towns in Chile and Peru. These episodes, paradoxically, make desert living systems even more evident, recently intensifying and expanding the extent of the blooming desert phenomenon. So how can the desert find its own agency, even if it continues to be portrayed as a growing threat for cities? The desert has always been a hinterland of life, but the relation with urban centers was lost as it became the mineral industrial hinterland of the world. It is in those very elements that thrive in the desert where a long-term agency of aridness can be found. The desert was once a forest, and the tamarugo is both capable of surviving for 400 years into the future while providing critical resources for subsistence. The Atacama cannot continue to be an expanding threat for the metropolis, but the opposite, a reservoir of resources and an implosion of life capable of transcending the shorter-term mineral booms that continue to cycle through it. If there is to be a new agreement among Andean states, the living systems of the desert must be its articulating concept. The life cycle of farming and herding in the Andes may be coupled with the non-stop process of mining. If extraction can respond and periodically slow down within the Andean time cycle, only then there is an acknowledgement of the aquifer recharge process within an arid setting. Look at the Andean ridge as a source of life at both sides of the glacial ridge will help rethink extraction from the geographic layout and outside of the Cartesian mining concession grid. The new grid will be the Prosopis species planting plan for the desert, where not only the tamarugo's adaptation to aridity but its physical stress to hydraulic failure will serve as an agent to subvert desert extraction. When the international Andean high plateau is treated as the irrigation start point both for the desert and metropolitan life, then the tamarugo will be the new resource worth fighting for. Its plant agency will be the only capable of repositioning the hinterland between city and desert. A new desert treatise will not be based on demarcating state borders upon a survey grid, but to dissolve those lines into the reservoir of life still locked under the ground.